Okay. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming. I know we've got a few more still coming in from the lobby, but we're going to get started now, just in the interest of time. So, but this is you should be joining an introduction to AI in qualitative research. So if that doesn't sound right to you, you may be in the wrong meeting. And as I say, in the interest of time, I'm just going to jump straight in. Okay, so a little bit about me to begin with. My name's Francis Mckay. Here I've got a little cheesy AI generated image of myself. I don't think it's really representative because it's aged me about 20 years younger, but I couldn't get it to give a 40-odd-year-old me at the moment for some reason. So my name is Francis Mckay. I'm a research lead at Gateshead Council's Health Determinants Research Collaboration, or HDRC. So the HDRCs are a series of kind of new research units that have been set up across several local authorities in the UK with funding from the NIHR, started a couple of years ago. And the Gateshead Council is one of those HDRCs. There are others across the UK, about 13 total. And I'm one of the research leads for. Okay. I think we get a bit of spillover of sound there, but if you could just keep microphones muted, that'd be great. So I'm one of the research leads for the Gateshead Council, HDRC, as I was saying. I'm also a research associate at Newcastle University's Population Health Sciences Institute. So the goal of today, this is an introduction to AI in qualitative research. The question we want to talk about today is, say you wanted to actually use AI for qualitative research right now, what do you need to know about? And so we're going to try and address that question in 3 parts. First, we're just going to have a quick understanding of what is meant by AI, examining some of the key concepts so people have got a bit of a grounding for those who are unfamiliar with it. We're also going to look at some applications of AI in qualitative research. That's the meat of it. That's presumably why people have come here today. And then we'll also consider some kind of critical issues that you need to consider if you are going to be using some of these tools in your research, and maybe some tips to get started. And as a few preliminaries on the issue, because this is an introductory course, I'm going to assume minimal experience here. There may be some people in the room that have a bit more knowledge about it, and that's okay. You might find it useful as a bit of a refresher in some respects, but it's not primarily aimed at those with a bit more knowledge about it. It's aimed at people who are really coming to it from pretty fresh, and therefore just assumes minimal experience. Secondly, it's also really for qualitative researchers wanting to use AI and not really vice versa. So my background is in interpretive social sciences and humanities. So I'm not a computer scientist or data scientist. And so I'm really coming at it from that perspective as someone who does qualitative research, but is interested in making use of some of these tools in the future. And so, yeah, that's my perspective, and that's the way I can best contribute, I think. Third point is that really the insights are provisional. As some of you may have noticed, this technology changes rapidly. And so, how this technology was a year ago, for instance, isn't the same as it was then. It won't be the same in a few months' time. And so all we can talk about is what the current state of the art is. And so that's just something to keep in mind, that the tech changes and the insights are therefore provisional. We're going to have about 45 minutes for the talk with a bit of time for question and answers at the end. The session is being recorded, so please do keep your microphones off. The cameras are optional. If you ask a question at the end, it'd be nice to have the cameras on to see who we're speaking to, but it is optional. And there'll also be the slides and recordings made available afterwards as well. So just to jump straight into it, part 1, what is AI? That's the kind of question that you need to get a grip with to begin with. I apologize for the cheesy robots images. It's kind of hard to visualize AI sometimes otherwise without robots, but as we'll see later, that's not really what we're getting at here. What is AI? Usually if you Google something like that, you go to Google Images, you'll be confronted with an image that looks something like this, a kind of nested diagram of different fields within AI. And you may have heard of some of these terms recently. Obviously, artificial intelligence is the more general category that everyone will have heard of. But within artificial intelligence, you have different kind of levels of field and research interests within that. So within artificial intelligence, you've got field of machine learning. Within machine learning, you've got an area called deep learning. And then within deep learning, you've got something called generative AI. And it can be quite hard as when you're new to the field to really be able to distinguish between what these terms mean. I've been trying to find a way for quite a while now to kind of give a quick and easy like lay summary of it. And I think I've kind of got a rough way of doing that, which is a useful entry point in. These are the kind of 4 key terms that you want to know, but you can actually reduce these 4 fields of AI into, I would say, 3 core terms. These core terms: intelligence, learning, and generative. And if you have an understanding of these 3 core terms, I think you'll be doing quite well to develop some understanding of what those fields were. And so I'm just going to go through some of those core terms as a way of doing that. So the first is intelligence. So everyone, will be familiar with the word intelligence. It might not have an explicit dictionary definition, but you'll use it in everyday language and maybe have some kind of pre-reflexive understanding of what is meant by intelligence. When we're talking about artificial intelligence, it generally gets defined as something like solving problems. So human beings, for instance, solve problems, different types of problems, sometimes quite complex and abstract problems, and how they do that is through their intelligence. Human beings, we tend to think of the key kind of reference for that intelligence, but we also recognize that animals have a kind of intelligence, and that sometimes we even test for that through different kind of experimental setups, as you can see here. So if you think about intelligence as problem solving, and that living systems have this, then the field of artificial intelligence is really about whether you can have that kind of problem solving intelligence in non-living systems. And here we have an example of that, which is a calculator. Everybody will be familiar with a calculator. A calculator can solve certain types of mathematical problems, but it's a non-living system, and so you could call it a form of artificial intelligence. And so when you talk about artificial intelligence, we're really talking about that kind of broad level that lots of things would classify as a form of artificial intelligence. Of course, the interesting thing about intelligence is that we're not necessarily just pre-programmed with our intelligence, that we have to learn about our environment in order to acquire intelligence. Human beings learn about their environment by observing things, but also by passing down the learning they have through the generations, through things like books, and which they use to kind of acquire more learning. And so that's one of the interesting things about intelligence. You don't just kind of already have it, you have to learn about it. And that's also true about animals. Obviously, in a different way, animals kind of develop their learning than humans, but they also have to learn about their environment. And so when the example of the calculator shows that not all AIs learn anything. So the calculator here is just pre-programmed with its knowledge base. So what it understands at the beginning of its life is the same thing as it understands more or less at the end of its life. And so the field of machine learning is really interested in whether you can get machines, forms of artificial intelligence, that learn and acquire knowledge that isn't already kind of basically pre-programmed into the basics of what they already have. So that's machine learning. Now, within machine learning, continuing with the learning aspect of this, you get something called deep learning. Now, I don't want to go into details of what deep learning is here, partly because I couldn't do justice to it. As I say, I'm not really a computer scientist. But I think the idea is it's an extension of this learning process. And the deep here is, there is a technical meaning of deep, but I think you can think of it as a kind of metaphor for a particularly complex form of learning process that's based upon large amounts of data. So if machine learning has to learn from data, the deep learning process has large amounts of data that it's learning from and works on a kind of trial and error. It tries to optimize some output in relation to that data, and the more successful it gets at that, the better it is in the learning process. And I think, you don't really need to know a lot about what deep learning is for today. I think the main point is it's this kind of AI that constitutes a lot of the progress that we're seeing in the field at the moment. The reason that we're seeing a lot of advancements is because deep learning has kind of had quite a bit of success of late. So of course, final point is that human beings, for instance, don't just learn things about their environment as part of their intelligence. They also create things. They write books. They, create sonnets, things. They make things as a result of their learning. And so the field of generative AI is really taking that to the next level. Can the machines that generate things based upon their learning? And so there are different types of things that machines can create. Here we've got an image of, image creation. That's one possibility. We could have video or sound creation. But what we're really focusing on today are the text generation of AI. And these are what are called large language models, or LLMs. And so I would probably slip into the language of using LLMs throughout this discussion because it's a quick shorthand. That's really what we're interested in today, this text generation machines, if you will, large language models, or LLMs. So you may have seen some examples of LLMs in the news over recent years. I would say these are all 4 examples of that, some of the bigger commercial ones. ChatGPT is probably the most popular at the moment, but you also have Copilot, which people who work in institutions might have more ready access to Copilot because it comes with Microsoft, and organizations tend to have already this in the system. But there are others as well. There's Anthropic's Claude AI. That's one I'm particularly interested in. I think that's kind of interesting one. It's not as well known, but quite powerful one. And then you've also got Google's Gemini as well as a bunch of others. So what do these things look like? Well, they look something like this, kind of like a traditional search box, similar to when you got the Google search box. It's just a place to kind of a landing page where you can input some text and get a response. But it's not really, what you're doing here is not really the same as a Google search, which is just tends to be putting in a few keywords. The point is that these work on a kind of an ability to synthesize natural language, the way you ordinarily speak. And then they produce a response in a way that's understandable at that level. So to give an illustration, here's one I've done a bit ago. Can you write something really nice about the researcher Francis Mckay and how great he is as a public health researcher in England, blah, blah, blah. And here it gives a kind of response in intelligible, maybe sycophantic English, replying to that. So Francis Mckay stands as a beacon of brilliance in public health, blah, blah, blah. I think you get the point there. It's a text generation machine rather than a kind of keyword search engine. So the point here is we're not dealing with robots here. We're not dealing with text generation. And I say that because I think if you're new to it, there's a tendency to think of AI as a kind of robot because of images in the media and whatnot, but that's not really what we're dealing with here. So how do they work? Well, it's basically a kind of advanced predictive text. Some of you will have a predictive text on your phone at the moment, where the phone tries to pick up tries to guess the next letter or the next word. It's a more advanced version of that and a quite complex version of it. I think that's probably the easiest way to understand it, is guessing the next word, but doing that a lot of times so you can create large, meaningful sentences. Because of this, some people have called them stochastic parrots, by which they mean that they're parroting information based upon probabilities. So these machines aren't necessarily telling you something because it knows it, it's just guessing the next plausible words based upon probabilities. So that means that it can sound plausible, but they really might just be imitating speech. And so to give an example of that, if we take our robotic parrot friend here, let's call our parrot friend Polybot. If we ask something like, does Polybot want a cracker? You might get a response that goes something like, yes, Polybot wants a cracker. An intelligible response to that question. You could ask it again, but you might get a different response that says, okay, is it Christmas already? I can't pull a cracker with my wings. So another intelligible response, but of a different kind of meaning. You could ask it a third time and it might say something else. It might say, okay, yes, I am fond of a joke. Go on, tell me a cracker. Different ways of kind of guessing what the output should be. So the point, these are, I think one way to think about these is as kind of guessing machines, but I don't really think that does them justice, because they are very sophisticated guessing machines, and they're becoming more sophisticated over time, to the point that it might actually be able to help us do some text-based work, including aspects of qualitative research, which is what we're interested in here. Okay, so point two, we've talked about what AI is, that there are different kind of fields: artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, and generative AI. But you can understand them in, what is intelligence, what is learning, and what does it mean for a kind of machine to try and emulate those processes. They also kind of certain types of AI as well that are specifically applied to kind of generating text. And that's where it comes in as useful for qualitative research. But in order to understand how they might be helpful here, it's maybe important to say a little bit about what qualitative research is first. So qualitative research, here I'm using it to mean research primarily involving unstructured narrative text data. So my background is in interpretive social sciences and humanities, large amount of time in anthropology, where I might do field work, do interviews, take field notes. And when you come back from collecting your data, you end up having at your disposal lots and lots of just unstructured narrative text. And the interesting question is whether AI can help us kind of mine some of that, because sometimes the amount is so large that we can't get through it manually. There's three kinds of text that you might be dealing with overall. There's primary data, so that's the textual data that I specifically have collected during my own personal research. There's secondary data, that's data usually that someone else has collected, so I don't have it at my disposal, someone else has collected it, but I might want to use that if I think I can get access to it. And there's tertiary data, so that's the stuff that it's not just been collected, it's not just been analysed, it's then been published as well, and it's readily available for everyone. We're really focusing on the first and the third today. I think the kind of secondary data issue is a bit of a special case, a bit more advanced because you don't have access to it primarily. So I think I'm just going to focus on the primary and tertiary data today. And so the question is, how can AI help us understand research in these areas? And there are different ways that the AI could help us in here. If you think about it in terms of, for instance, the research life cycle, there's different stages of the research life cycle, and the research life cycle itself is a bit complex and messy. It's not necessarily in a stage process. These things may overlap, but we could just generally think of it as having something like 4 stages: planning, data collection, analysis, and dissemination. And similarly, because I'm only focusing on primary and tertiary data today, I'm also just going to focus on 2, which I think are the main ones and be the main interest for people at the moment, which is AI in the planning stage and AI in the data collection stage. The reason for that is AI in the planning and AI in the analysis stage. The reason for that is data collection is a bit more controversial. It's a bit more of a complex case, a bit beyond the beginner stage. And dissemination, you can use it for that, but it's kind of at the tail end. I think we first need to get a sense of how to use it in planning and analysis. Okay. So to have a think about AI might be used in terms of the research life cycle in those 2 phases. Let's just choose a case study to think about. So say I'm developing a project on, and I'm just going to choose a topic here, one I'm familiar with, the adverse effects of meditation. So I've done a lot of research on mindfulness meditation in the past. There's relevance of mindfulness meditation to public health. Many people have seen things in the news about the health and well-being effects of meditation practice, for instance, and mindfulness-based meditation practices. But say as a researcher, I've gone through all that, but I have an intuition that, hang on a minute, all medications we say have some kind of side effects to it. Here we're developing an intervention that seems to be just always talked about in terms of how good it is. Is there any possible side effects for meditation? So I can start thinking about, maybe I want to develop a research project on the adverse effects of meditation. So how might I proceed with a project like this? Well, first of all, you'd have several planning needs, I think. First of all, you'd want to know what's already been said on that topic, what we traditionally call the literature review. You'd also want to know not just what's already been said, but then what you want specifically to talk about in relation to that, which we often talk about in terms of the research gap, the question, the aims and objectives, things like that. And then you'd also want to know about, okay, I know what's been said, I know roughly what I want to do about it, but how am I actually going to go out and collect data, and what's my method going to be here? Now, the idea is in this planning stage, you've got all these needs, and AI is not particularly important for any one of those, but more that it's useful generally for brainstorming ideas across those needs, and doing so iteratively. And by iteratively there, I mean you don't need just a one-shot attempt at it by just typing something and trying to get an answer. That's not how these things work. They're kind of conversational agent. And so the iteration there is you can keep going back and you can refine your self-understanding of these different things through the conversation. So the most simplest approach you might take, say you don't know anything about the adverse effects of meditation or anything about your research project, you could just give an open question effectively. Say something like, I'm developing a research project on this topic and need to develop a first draft project plan that contains essential information like methods, literature review, etc. But I've got writer's block. How might I best proceed? I think that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It won't give you the most nuanced output as a result of that, but it might just get you on the start to kind of getting a sense of what you need to be mindful of. Another approach, if you're really starting from a place of limited knowledge, is you could do something what's called deep research. The different systems have different names for this. This is what ChatGPT calls it. And it's a way for the machine to go away and do a bit more research on the topic on your behalf, if you will. So it can look like something like this. As I said, different systems have different ones. This is ChatGPT. There's a special button you can click in the bottom left to select for deep research. But say we can ask a question like, can you provide a high order summary of the adverse effects of mindfulness therapies, what it means for public health, and recommendations for mindfulness therapies in light of them? Say I just don't know a lot about this subject matter, but I want to get a high order overview. And then the AI will go away for 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes, and it'll try and synthesize what it finds on the internet and based upon its own knowledge base, what's been said on that topic. And it might give you a response like this. This is obviously just a kind of snippet because that's all I can fit on the page. But it's the introduction for a kind of longer reports that the AI has gone away from synthesizing information on this topic. What this is good for, it's good for, I would say, a kind of rapid, high-order overview and as a way to familiarize yourself with key conceptual issues that you don't really know about because you're coming from a place of relative ignorance on the topic. And it's analogous to having something like a research assistant giving a tidy report on the topic, or maybe something like a Wikipedia entry is another way of thinking about it. What you don't want to do is confuse it with a systematic literature review because it's not doing that. It's just going away, finding things on the internet, finding things maybe in the literature that's available on the internet, and giving you a kind of a synthesized summary of what it's found. But I say useful for kind of getting a sense of the kind of key conceptual terrain, if you will. Now that being said, those were two examples for when you're starting from a place of relative ignorance and you don't really know what your topic much about the topic. But it's rarely that we're starting from scratch in that respect as researchers. And so another alternative is that you can work with the knowledge base that you already possess on your computers or in your notes through something like what's called projects. Again, different systems call them different things. I'm just going to call them projects here. So to give an example of that, I've done lots of readings actually on the adverse effects on meditation. Here's my Zotero database. So Zotero, for those who don't know it, is a kind of bibliographic management system similar to EndNote and Mendeley. It's a way of collecting the readings you've done, making notes, and having that all in a tidy place in useful categories. So you can see here on the left-hand panel, we've got a kind of a collection of readings on the adverse effects of mindfulness. On the right-hand panel, you see that I've got about 46 different readings on this, and in the central panel, all those blue highlights are the notes I've taken on those readings. So I've read through all those readings and I've taken notes on them, and they're all stored in my Zotero database. So there's 46 different texts there. There's a lot of text I've got to get through to try and synthesize my own understanding of it. Can the AI help? Well, yes, it can. We could export those notes and upload them to something like one of the AI. So here we've got Google's Notebook LM. You don't have to use this. This is one that I'm kind of using as illustration. And we could create a project or what they call a notebook, and same idea, a space where you can upload your files. So here I have one called meditation adversities, and I can simply upload the files, that my own personal notes on the readings, to that project. And so you see all the list of those things on the left-hand side, and then the AI will already start ingesting that information and try and provide you some summary information about it. So here it's already done that. So these are sources primarily, his reading from it itself. These sources primarily concern the adverse effects of meditation, blah, blah, blah. It deals with issues like anxiety, depression, etc. I know this information, I would say that's pretty accurate. What you'll also see is in the bottom right, it also gives you some follow-up questions that you can ask about it. You can either input your own question or it'll give you some suggested questions. So, okay, it's ingested the knowledge. We're now beginning the process of having a dialogue with the system to try and refine our self-understanding about this topic. And so this one says, what are the most common adverse effects across different contemplative traditions? That seems like a reasonable question here. And so I'll ask that question and it will go away and try and find that information within your knowledge base that you've uploaded. And so here it's give the top categories of adverse effects for meditation, give a percentage for the prevalence, but more importantly, also give some footnotes for where it's found that information, so you can go and double check that the information is actually accurate. So again, that's just some way you can start the conversation going. You could ask any question at that point. That's just one of them. And it's about refining your self-understanding. So we want to ask another question. So we've kind of got a sense of what's in there. We've got some, we're getting a stronger understanding of what we're interested in, but want to develop some specific research questions. You could ask it to help you brainstorm some research questions. So suggest 5 possible qualitative research questions here that could be explored with interview or ethnographic methods, for instance. And here, I don't show it all, it's just an illustration. It gives some examples of the types of research questions that one can consider. I'm not particularly interested in talking about any particular one of them, it's just giving you examples. The idea is it's easier to work with, often to work with something that's drafted than to come up with something from scratch. And so it can give you that first leg up to thinking through some interesting questions for you to reflect on them and refine which ones you actually want to work on. Then we could take it another step further. Okay, we've got our understanding of maybe a research question. Say, I've got my research question now. Can we actually use it to help us draft an interview guide? Well, yes, we could. You can give a prompt like draft an interview guide on around one of the topics, including 8 open-ended questions. And it will give you some kind of, again, some questions that you might want to consider for the interview guide. Again, you're not taking it at its word here. It's just a kind of a drafting machine in that respect. For you to get some insights to and help you develop in your understanding. So in the planning stages, then I think the point is it's good for what I would call a myriad little things. You can help synthesize pre-existing literature based upon, for instance, notes that you've taken. You could refine your understanding of what a research question is. You can help develop data collection instruments like interview guides, or if you're coming from a place of little knowledge, you can develop some rapid conceptual literacy through things like deep research. So that's all in the planning stages. So what about analysis then? Thing that people tend to be a little more interested in. Well, I really think analysis is, we're talking about 2 moments when we talk about analysis. In the first moment, we're talking about what I'll call analysis proper, which is, you've collected your data, you want to understand what's in the data. We usually do that through something called coding. So here we've got a transcript, and what we do is we read through that transcript, we highlight sections, and those highlight sections, we give them a label or a code. And it's a way of reducing the complexity of all that narrative text to fewer categories, to help you understand what's going on in there. You can obviously do this process in different ways. You could do it inductively or deductively, is often how it's characterized. Inductively is I just read through my transcript, and as I read along, I try and assign labels that make sense to me based upon that reading. So not coming with a prior understanding of what the labels are, but developing them in situ. And then deductive is kind of the reverse. Deductive is I think I know what I want my labels to be already, and it's reading through with an eye to that and assigning the labels that you already have in your mind to the text. In reality, we tend to do a little bit of both. So I'm not saying we need to favour one or the other here. We tend to do a bit of both with coding. So what does the research say about that? Can AI help with inductive or deductive coding? Well, apparently the argument is yes, it can, though there's a qualification because there are different opinions on the quality. So some researchers, research says that yes, you can do it, and it's basically as good as human coders, and so it's pretty legitimate to use it in that respect. Others research says it's you can use it, but it's not as good as human coders, so you really do need a human oversight in some respect. That being said, it is probably quicker, and so there are efficiency gains that are important that you might really want to consider it in, even though it might not be as good, the efficiency gains are so good that it's something that we should take seriously. So how you would do it similar to how we did the planning stage. It's uploading your files, asking it to help you code effectively. Now, that being said, I don't actually really use it for coding. There are different reasons for that, some of which I'll come to later. Really, I'm using it for the second moment of the analysis stage, what I would call synthesis. So if analysis is trying to figure out what's in the data set, in that textual data set, and synthesis is kind of saying, okay, now I know what's in there. What specifically do I want to say about that thing? There's lots of different things in it. How do I want to contribute to the literature, say, or how do I want to build theory? What do I specifically want to say about the data? How do I want to synthesize what's in there for myself? And the idea is, I think this is really where I think the LLMs become quite important because you can use them as a kind of conversational agent once again to refine your insights around what you particularly want to say about the subject matter. And it would be similar to the brainstorming stage I mentioned earlier when talking about planning. And so how would you get started with that? Well, as I say, it's similar to the planning stage, except there is a qualification that needs to be stressed here because different systems have different issues when it comes to doing the analysis. And the main problem here is that in the planning stage, you hadn't collected any data. So really, you were just using the data that's already out there and available, so i.e. tertiary data, the published stuff. And so that's fine, you can use any system for that. But once you've gone out and collected data, you're suddenly using people's personal data that you collected, and the issue becomes a bit more complicated at that point because there's issues of privacy that you have to take into consideration. And so at this point, we have different systems we can use, and each have their different pros and cons. So on the one hand, you could use the proprietary systems. So these are the commercial ones mentioned earlier. These are things like ChatGPT, Copilot, Claude, Google, etc. The benefits of these is that I would say, pretty easy to use. They're cheap and they're powerful. So easy to use, kind of like going to Google search. You can just type something and have a conversation. You could do that right now, go to ChatGPT's website and do that right now. They're cheap. Many of them have a free tier that you can use to play around with this. There might be a limited amount of time you get as a result of that, but they do have free tiers. And even some of the paid tiers are relatively affordable, maybe like £20 a month. So you can get access to them quite easily. They're also powerful. These are some of the most powerful LLMs on the planet. So if you do use these, you're getting the most frontier technologies and the best that are kind of available to you. But the main stumbling block is there's absolutely privacy concerns when it comes to primary data. And so, as I say, after you've collected the data, you probably do have people's kind of personal data. Even you may have de-identified that, but it doesn't completely get around the issue because this would require you uploading that data to kind of commercial organizations in the US whose data governance systems might be slightly different. So there's an issue there around the primary privacy and primary data analysis. That being said, I think it would be fine for the tertiary data and perhaps even anonymized primary data. But I say perhaps because you just have to be very sure from an ethics and data governance perspective that you can consider your data anonymous. The other option, given the privacy concerns around the commercial ones, is to do the open source route. So here we have an example of that. There are many open source models, I should say, that are out there. A model is just one of the LLMs. It's just a file on your computer. If you get an open source version of them, you need some software to talk to the file. Here's one of the piece of software which is called GPT for All. There are others as well, and it just enables you to kind of, as you see on the right hand side, you can find the models, so you can find the open source models. The middle section says you can upload your own personal documents, so you've got your knowledge base in there, and then the left-hand side allows you to start chatting between the two. So it's just an interface that allows you to use these on your home computer. These are more ideal for the primary data because it's all processed locally. You're not sharing anything on the cloud. It's just on your personal computer, so it's no real different than just how you would usually be working with your data, your primary data. That being said, you usually either have weaker models or you need more expensive computers for the more powerful models. So there are powerful open source models, but they're power hungry and they tend to require computing power that most households don't have. And so you tend to then therefore have to default to a weaker models that just aren't as good as the cutting edge ones that you find through the commercial vein. There's also an issue that they require a certain amount of technical know-how to install, and therefore they might also be an obstacle for just a beginner to get going with those. All this means you're probably left with 3 options, I would say, overall, if you wanted to get started. You can use those commercial options that we talked about, things like ChatGPT, but you'd want to be using it for the tertiary data, so not the primary data, not people's personal data. Alternatively, you could use open source for primary data, but with an awareness of the limitations. That you might be using a weaker model, that would be kind of slower at processing and things like that. Or the final one, which is probably the best one ultimately for long term, make a case with the department to purchase some kind of enterprise version and confirm that the security satisfies data governance principles. Some organizations are making a bit of progress on that. It's one of the reasons where a lot of organizations are starting to allow staff to use Copilot, is because they're developing the data governance around this. But you would need to confirm this. It's not something that is just obviously you will have by virtue of having Copilot. It still may be a bit ambiguous, and so you would need to speak to whoever deals with data governance at your organization to confirm that it would satisfy the security around that. Okay, so this brings me on to what are some of the kind of critical issues you should consider around this. On the right-hand side here, we see a bit of a word cloud with a bunch of the ethical issues that one have to think about generally in relation to AI. I'm not going to go through all of these. There's lots of research on AI ethics. It's a large discourse. It's not something we can do justice to in the last minutes. Really, I just want to focus on 3 core issues that anyone beginning with these tools really ought to be mindful of if they're going forward with it. First one, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is the privacy issue. And the basic point is don't upload primary data to these commercial versions without some kind of institutional agreement. I'm stressing this because I know for a fact some people do it. I've had conversations with researchers who have basically admitted behind the scenes that they do things like this, and you really shouldn't be doing it. It's a privacy liability, and it's something that everyone needs to be thinking about immediately, and therefore not be tempted to do it because of the usefulness of these machines. You could also consider the offline open source for the privacy, as I say, but there's actually still a lingering question of whether we need consent to do this. I'm unsure what I think of this at the moment. On the one hand, it's not uncontroversial to be processing primary data using AI systems, and therefore there's a prima facie case to say that we should probably asking consent for people to do so. That being said, I don't know whether that's what we want long term. I prefer the idea that we get our data governance systems solid around this. Therefore, and to make it so kind of secure and ethical, these systems, that consent wouldn't be an issue to begin with in the first place. It would just be like using any other tool. But we're not there yet, and therefore there's a question of whether you ought to be in your ethics permissions be asking for consent for processing data using the AI. So that's the first one, the privacy issues and privacy and consent related to that. The second issue would be accuracy. As I mentioned earlier, these things are described as stochastic parrots, or kind of guessing machines, sycophantic guessing machines. So in guessing, they're trying to just give you a plausible sounding response, and therefore something that you will find intelligible and sounds good to you. One way that, as a result of that, they can make things up. They just completely fabricate things. And this is what's called AI hallucination. They just invent things but it sounds plausible. I don't think this is as big a problem as often made out to be, because in research, I think there's a response to it is basically you just verify everything. And as a researcher, I feel like that's my duty anyway to verify everything. So if I read a quote in an article that's coming from somewhere else and I want to use that quote, I don't just quote the article, I go and find the original source where the quote is from, and I read it to make sure the quote is correct, and I read the surrounding information to make sure it's been interpreted correctly, or I may have a different interpretation of it. And so I already do that due diligence of verifying everything anyway. And so it's just no different, I would see, from a research perspective when it comes to talking about AI. I would expect us all to do that anyway. I think the problem is that it would be easy to be tempted to be a bit sloppy because of how plausible sounding these machines can be, and that you might let your guard down. So this is just a kind of encouragement to say, don't let your guard down. You do need to verify everything like you ordinarily would do in research. Third issue would be bias. There's lots of writings on the problems of bias in AI at the moment. Clearly, AI does exhibit biases, but one of the qualifications I want to say about this is that can be both a good and a bad thing, or to put it another way, that it's not clear that being biased itself is either a good or a bad thing. It's more that there are some biases that can be problematic and there's some that can be helpful. And I think the idea that the strategy of just trying to get rid of bias in our systems is probably not going to work if you're just trying to get rid of all biases. My view is you can't get rid of biases. They're in everywhere. Human beings have biases. Some are useful, some are not so useful, some are harmful. And so really it's an empirical question about thinking through the specific biases that are coming through in your the outputs you're getting from the AI. Because of that, one useful thing that you can do is you can prompt differently. So yes, they are biased, but you can ask them questions to think about things in another way. So if it's giving you some kind of biased output, you can ask it to consider things from the vantage point that you think is being left out in that bias. So there are different ways in which you can handle bias in that respect. Okay, so privacy, accuracy, and bias are the ones you probably want to be thinking most about as you go forward. And the final point, I just want to end with a few key tips. Again, these are beginner tips. The first point is just to familiarize yourself with them. The main issue I think we have at the moment is this is a new technology. It's quite complex, and therefore there can be an anxiety around even attempting to use them in the first place. And as these become more and more part of our systems and more part of society, if you don't get some familiarity with them, you kind of going to put yourself in a kind of self-imposed digital divide or digital exclusion. And so the only way you can kind of avoid that is to just start having a go with them and familiarize yourself with the topic. Fortunately, there are different options you can use at the moment, as I say, many of them with free tiers, so you could go and just play around with any of those systems at the moment. If you are going to experiment with them, just to emphasize the privacy point again, you want to be using tertiary documents, I would say, kind of readings, but you can, that's not necessarily a problem. There's lots and lots of work you can do by just experimenting with these things with the existing literature. I would say that's a large amount of what I do is kind of uploading readings and having dialogues to refine my understanding of things. Third point is the difference between prompt strategies and having a conversation. So the prompt is the information you put into the chatbot to get a response. And the idea is that some people think there are better and worse prompts that you can put into these things to enable a more optimized output. So Google, for instance, has published a report on different prompt strategies you can use. You could go online and read that. It's pretty useful. They've got some interesting things there. But from a beginner, I would say you don't need to worry too much about prompt strategies to begin with. Rather, I think you will want to think about it as just trying to have a conversation in the same way that you wouldn't try to, in the same way that you have a conversation with a friend at home or on social media or in a bar, you wouldn't think of it in terms of a prompt strategy to maximize the efficiency of the output from your friend. You would just have a conversation and let your understanding unfold through that conversation. And I think as a beginner perspective, that's probably the best way of thinking about the LLMs, treat it in a similar way rather than trying to strategize the prompting. That being said, the one prompt I think is useful is that the more context it has, it's usually the better, with a kind of upper limit. So this isn't a Google keyword search, in other words. You're not just writing in one sentence. it needs some information to go on. Earlier, I uploaded about 46 different kind of notes from my readings, and that give it a much more expansive database to kind of work with and to give to derive some insights from. And often I'll spend like 5, 10, sometimes 30 minutes trying to write a kind of my prompt by giving it all the contextual information so I can have a more considered response. So I think the general idea is that don't just treat it like a Google search or something like that, or a keyword search. I think a bit more information is usually better here. And finally, I just want to say, don't worry about getting it right the first time. This is the point about it being conversational and experiment and play with it. You don't need to get it right the first time. They've got an ability to kind of synthesize things over a conversation. And so really you can keep going back and refining your kind of discussion with the machine over time through that iterative process. So yes, go away, have a play with it. I'm going to stop there. Thanks everyone for listening. I'm looking forward to hearing some the questions. I think we've got about just under 15 minutes for that. I'll stop sharing my screen as well. Okay, so if I can take some, I think I just saw some hands up, but oh, that's who's the first?
There are a few questions in the chat, Francis. I don't know if you want to start with.
Yeah, so slides will be shared afterwards. Yes. So Nafis says the iteration process could itself divert from new, fresh themes towards standardized and known themes of the context, specifically of different communities. What is your opinion? Yeah, I think that could happen. I don't think it has to happen, or I don't think it's inevitable. I mean, the idea is you don't just have to follow what the machine tells you. You're having you're bringing your interpretive judgment to play upon the outputs of the machine. So I don't see why it would have to go in that direction. But if you were being a bit careless, maybe in your relationship with it, I think it would go in that direction. I personally find it more interesting to use it to try and nuance my views on things that are missing and things that haven't been considered. So I don't think it has to just go in, one direction as such. But these are probabilistic machines. They can go in lots of different directions, and they might even have infinite kind of combinatorial possibilities. So the idea that they'll go in one direction or another, I'm not convinced by. That being said, I get the spirit of the question. I think there might be a tendency for us to fall into that trap. Okay, another one from Nafis here. While analysing the transcripts, there is also a huge difference in what to generate. Huge difference if we want to generate what do people do type of questions versus why and how they do it. Okay, can you point towards any standard guidance to know more about when we should or shouldn't use them? I don't think I can point to standard guidance to when we should or shouldn't use them. I'm of the opinion that we should start using them more often than not, just on that kind of familiarization point. I don't think we'll get a tasteful and refined practical understanding of these tools if we give ourselves some prior, or you just can't use it for this, that, or the other. We need to kind of test these limits for these things for ourselves. So I'm not sure if I've heard any guidance on this. There may be some available. I mean, and it's something I'll have to think about afterwards. But that would be my first take on it, I suppose. Okay, so one from Madeline, do these same privacy issues apply to AIs such as Copilot that organizations have paid subscriptions to, or is this privacy part of the paid arrangement? Yeah, I mean, it's very complicated, this, and I don't know all the details. So Copilot's probably getting the closest because Copilot is Microsoft. Most organizations are already paying for some kind of enterprise version of Microsoft, and Microsoft, there are ways of processing data under a kind of Microsoft contractual agreement that satisfies the kind of privacy issues of the particular organization. And it's why you're finding institutions now allowing you to use Copilot. I can't answer that for all organizations. It's you have to speak to your organization to confirm that that is the case. I'm in discussions, for instance, at the moment with my own organisation about this, and I'm still not 100% sure, and I'm waiting for a response on it. So there are other paid subscriptions like NVivo, for instance, are developing these tools. And NVivo's, I was looking at the data security. Overall, it sounds reasonable, but I would say it still doesn't 100% satisfy our kind of privacy requirements. You're still going to be processing data in the US rather than on kind of UK servers and things like that through something like NVivo. So there's still an issue there. Does the privacy issue apply to all AIs? Probably not. I think you could do some early topic modeling that would be easier to do on your local computer without needing it to send to these kind of big, powerful models. You can do a certain type of analysis without that, probably. I'm not a specialist in that, so I couldn't tell you for sure. But my understanding is you don't need the LLMs to do the analysis stage in terms of coding. There are other types of tools you can use, which would also be called AIs. And those might not have the same privacy issues because you don't necessarily need to send the data over to OpenAI, for instance, to process it. You could probably do it locally. I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that would be the case. So there's a question from Laura: where do you stand with the environmental issues associated with these tools? I'm uncomfortable with it, but I don't know what my position is yet on it. The environmental issue is a massive thing, and it's not just AI related. But obviously these things are absolutely power hungry and are going to consume a lot of energy. But I don't think we have an understanding of what the cost benefits are in relation to energy. If these can do some work, then theoretically there's a possibility that you could save amount of time spent doing certain types of work at the cost of some upfront energy. Whether that means overall energy consumption is higher, I don't know. I think we'd be inclined to think it is just because of how power hungry they are, but I don't know of studies that have kind of actually compared that. Alam has, I was wondering, do you think ChatGPT could potentially replace NVivo for parts of our qualitative data analysis, or will we still need to use NVivo for coding and theme development? I suspect what will happen is actually NVivo will be, I mean, they are doing it. They're trying to embed these systems into NVivo. And the way NVivo does it right now, as I understand it, is they have an extra add-on and they're using ChatGPT within their own system. So if you want to do some LLM assisted kind of analysis with NVivo, they're basically sending your data to ChatGPT anyway. So I suspect the way it'll be is ChatGPT will start calling, or similar programs like that will corner the market, and they'll get embedded into already existing things. NVivo's got a lot of other things that you can use it that helps you kind of manage the overall data. I think that's probably the main benefit of it is ChatGPT isn't a research tool in that respect. It's just a website effectively where you can upload some files, whereas NVivo really helps you collect all the data in a kind of neat and tidy way. And so I actually think there'd be a strong role for something like NVivo to continue to play a role. Michael Viggers, in terms of analysis, what is your experience of deploying a qual method such as Braun and Clark's thematic analysis with an LLM? Well, as I say, I don't really use it for that purpose. I'm kind of interested in it, and part of the reason I haven't done it is because I tend to want to do that on the primary data, not necessarily on the tertiary data, and because the privacy isn't sorted around these things, I don't feel comfortable attempting it. I've done a kind of experimental one where you just created some synthetic fake data and tried it out, and it kind of worked a bit. It gave me a few generic kind of themes. I paid attention more to, there is actually research out there that has actually done this, and the research it says different things. It says, yes, it's as good as a human being at doing the something like thematic analysis. Other people say it's not as good, but it's a lot quicker, effectively, and therefore more cost effective. So Stephanie Bruckner, we Suffolk Council are looking to commission training on using AI for working with evidence, a fairly broad and flexible brief, but to include a focus on using AI for literature reviews. Do you or anyone on here have any suggestions on where to look for a provider? I don't know whether or not, I presume this is kind of maybe automating the literature review process a little bit through AI. There are some organizations out there. I believe there's one called Consensus, and there are a couple of others that I forget. I don't really rate them very much at the moment. The main reason being they seem to be focused a lot more on kind of clinical medical data rather than qualitative stuff. They don't have access to a great deal of that, so they can go out and do a literature review and try and synthesize that information for you, but it would be relying on certain types of databases that I don't tend to make use of because it's a bit more medical or clinical. And I don't really know of the quality of them. They'll give you similar to that Wikipedia report aspect earlier that I mentioned. It'll give you something and it'll probably be okay. Deep research can have some nuances that are quite interesting. But my view is doing a literature review is an art form, and it requires a lot of effort. And the idea that you could automate that process without kind of a strong author input, I'm not too sure. But like I said, you could try around some of the programs like Consensus. I think they're one of the main ones for the literature review at the moment. So Lorna says, if an LLM or generative AI tool used to support drafting a journal manuscript for publication, does this need to be documented in the methods section? I think different journals have different preferences. If you're using an LLM, they tend to say these days, tell us that you've used it and how to use it. It's not necessarily in the method section, it's usually in an acknowledgement section. If you were using the tool as a method, you would want to use it in the method section. But if you were just using it to help you draft up and edit the paper, I think that would just be more in the acknowledgement section and in the declarations towards the end. And ultimately, I suspect that should drop out. I don't see, if we all start using these things in the future, we could just have a blanket assumption that we're all using these tools in the same way that we all use Word to edit a document. I'm not sure you need those declarations indefinitely. It strikes me as a bit more of a conservative judgment right now because people don't know exactly what to think about the LLMs. So Jamie said, we do have access to NVivo in our organization. Is the AI function an add-on to a package, and how would it be used in the application? So I'm trying to figure this out at the moment myself. I'm not speaking with NVivo later today because I can't get mine to work, so I can't totally answer it. But my understanding is it's an add-on package, and whether the add-on package has been paid for, it just depends on whether your institution has paid for it already. And I suspect not, given the data governance issues, but it is theoretically there, and you could pay for it yourself. So Alicia, do you think there is scope in the future for AI to conduct interviews based on topic guide? Could you replicate the human ability to think of additional questions? So interesting question, because in a research project with researchers at Durham University, where we're looking at exactly this project of whether you can use it for conducting interviews. There has been some work at LSE as well on this. It's very early days. Theoretically, yes, you can do it. Issues of quality will naturally arise. So Alex says, with proprietary models like ChatGPT, you can toggle the data controls so that it doesn't use your consent to train their models. What does this actually mean? Does it mean your data is not held by them indefinitely and is deleted when you choose to delete all chats? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means they won't train their models. They still might see it and use it in other means, and it doesn't mean they'll delete it either. The NVivo use of it does specifically have a contractual requirement for them to not store any data, but just using ChatGPT wouldn't do that under a kind of basic model, basic free tier or the basic payment system. They just wouldn't use it for training. I know we're getting to the end, Eleanor. I'm happy to continue a bit longer if that's helpful, or should we be closing down the questions at this point to sign off?
And we can take the remaining questions away and then kind of provide the answer in the email that we send out after the session, if that's easiest. There's a lot of interest in this topic, so I'm sure there'll be future sessions on this as well.
Yeah, there's a few more questions. I'm obviously not going to get them to be able to answer them all in the time available. So what I'll do is I'll try and copy and paste these into an email document, and I can maybe email yourself, Eleanor, or Nicola, and we could provide some response by email, if that's all right.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Francis, and everyone for joining us today.
Okay, thanks everyone for your time. Hope that was helpful.